The smoke is so thick it burns your eyes before you even understand what is happening. Your home, built by hand, defended with hope more than weapons, is already on fire. The screens around you come in pieces. A child crying somewhere behind a wall. A man shouting once, then going silent. The sound you will remember most is not the noise. It is the moment when the noise stops. When you realize the men are already dead, and the footsteps are coming for you. You are a woman on the American frontier in the year 1758. There is no army coming. No law. No rescue. In the next few minutes, everything that made you who you were, your language, your faith, your family, your name, will be stripped away. Not later. Not slowly. Today. Most people think they know this history. They think it is simple. They imagine screaming raids, savage violence, and helpless victims. Or they imagine the opposite, peaceful tribes and exaggerated frontier myths. Both versions are wrong. The truth lives in the space people avoid. The space where survival, cruelty, kindness, and horror exist at the same time. What happened to white European women taken during the Indian Wars was not one story. It was many stories, and they did not follow the rules people want history to follow. Some women were beaten, raped, and destroyed in ways so extreme that later historians refused to write the details down. Others were adopted, protected, and treated as daughters when tribes were desperate to replace the dead. Some women died on the trail. Some lived long lives and refused to return when given the chance. Some were enslaved. Some were married. Some lost everything twice, once when they were captured, and again when they were forced to return. The march into captivity broke bodies. The waiting broke minds. And what happened after depended on who took you, where they took you, and whether fate decided to spare you or finish you. This is not a clean story. There are no heroes here. There is only fear, survival, and the hard truth that human beings can be capable of both mercy and unimaginable cruelty, sometimes in the same breath. This story is about women history tried to simplify, sanitize, or forget. And once you step into it, you don't come out unchanged. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The attack almost always came at dawn. That was not an accident. Dawn was when men were slow, weapons were still stacked against walls, and guards, if there were any, were tired and cold. The frontier settlements were quiet at that hour. Smoke from cooking fires drifted low. Children slept close to their mothers. Women believed they still had one more ordinary morning left. They were wrong. The first sound was often dogs barking. Then shouting. Then gunfire that did not come from inside the settlement. By the time most people understood what was happening, it was already over. Warriors moved fast, faster than settlers believed possible. They did not form lines. They did not announce themselves. They appeared out of the trees, out of the fog, out of the smoke itself. Men tried to fight. That mattered more than they knew. In these raids, adult white men were almost never taken alive. To the warriors, every armed man was part of the invasion that had been creeping forward year by year, cutting forests, fencing land, spreading disease, and breaking treaties. A man with a gun was not a potential captive. He was a threat that had to be erased immediately. So husbands were killed in front of wives. Fathers were cut down in front of children. Sometimes quickly. Sometimes not. The goal was not only death. It was terror. Terror broke resistance faster than bullets. For the women watching, time fractured. Many later said they remembered details that made no sense, how red the dirt looked, how loud breathing sounded inside their own ears, How quiet it became after the screaming stopped. Some froze. Some ran. Running rarely worked. Children were pulled from arms. Mothers who refused to let go were beaten until their grip failed. Infants who slowed the group during retreat were sometimes killed on the spot. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was calculation. A raid that moved slowly died. Then came the moment that marked the true beginning of captivity. Hands grabbed hair, wrists, shoulders. Some women were bound. Others were forced forward at knife point. They were not allowed to look back. The settlement behind them burned, sending black smoke into the sky like a signal that there was nothing left to return to. The march began immediately. There was no pause to grieve. No burial. No mercy for weakness. Women were driven into forests they did not know, across rivers they had never seen, over rocky ground that tore their shoes apart within hours. Food was scarce. Water was rationed. Crying was dangerous. Falling behind was fatal. If a woman collapsed and could not rise, she was killed and left where she fell. Not later. Not after discussion. Right there. The rest were forced to watch, because watching taught obedience faster than words ever could. This was the test. Not of strength, but of usefulness. The women did not yet know it, but everything depended on what the tribe needed. Some tribes were bleeding members faster than they could replace them. Disease had emptied villages. Warfare had killed warriors, sisters, daughters. In those tribes, a woman who survived the march was valuable. In others, captives were trophies, labor, or something far darker. But at this stage, none of that mattered yet. All that existed was the road under bleeding feet, the weight of loss pressing on the chest, and the terrible understanding that survival would not mean safety. It would only mean the chance to face whatever waited next. The old life was already gone. And the new one had not yet revealed its price. The march did not end after one day. It went on for many days. Sometimes for weeks. At first, the women counted time by the sun. One sunrise. One sunset. One more night on cold ground. But soon even that stopped mattering. Their bodies learned a new rule: walk or die. Shoes were the first thing to fail. Leather split. Soles peeled away. Feet swelled, blistered, and then tore open. Blood marked the path behind them. No one stopped for bandages. No one slowed down. Food was scarce by design. Captives were not fed to be comfortable. They were fed to keep moving. A handful of dried corn. A piece of meat shared between several people. Sometimes nothing at all for an entire day. Water came from streams when the group passed one. If the water was dirty, they drank it anyway. Thirst hurt more than sickness. Children suffered the most. Young boys who could walk were forced to keep pace. Girls clung to older women, terrified and silent. Infants were a problem. They cried. They slowed the group. Some were taken from their mothers and killed. Others were carried for a time, only to be abandoned later when the trail became too hard. Many women later said this was when something inside them broke. Not during the raid. Not when they saw their husbands die. But on the trail, when they realized that crying did not bring comfort and silence did not bring safety. Nothing they did could change what was happening. The warriors watched closely. They were not all cruel. Some ignored the captives completely. Others shouted or struck them to keep them moving. A few offered water or pushed food into a shaking hand. Those small acts were confusing. They made the terror worse, not better. Kindness without freedom only deepened the fear. Every night, the captives were tied or guarded. Fires burned nearby. Voices spoke in languages the women did not understand. Laughter sometimes drifted through the trees, and that laughter felt unbearable. It sounded like the world continuing without them. Some women tried to run. Very few succeeded. The land was vast and unfamiliar. Forests closed in from every side. Rivers twisted and doubled back. Even women who escaped their bindings often ran straight into darkness, panic guiding them more than reason. Those who were caught were beaten, sometimes killed in front of the others. Escape became a lesson, not a hope. As the days passed, the women began to understand something terrible. They were not all being treated the same. Some were guarded more closely. Some were struck more often. Some were watched with interest rather than anger. Older women were often ignored or burdened with extra labor. Younger women were studied carefully. Their health, their strength, their obedience were all noticed. This was not random. The tribes were deciding their fate. Many Native American communities were dying during this period. European diseases had torn through villages without warning. Entire families vanished in weeks. Mothers, daughters, sisters, gone. The tribe did not have time to mourn before the next outbreak came. Captives were not just prisoners. They were replacements. A strong woman could work. She could cook, gather, farm, tan hides. She could bear children. She could become something else. But not everyone would be allowed to reach that future. The march was a filter. Those who survived it proved they were worth keeping. Those who failed were erased without ceremony. By the time the group finally slowed, by the time smoke from a distant village appeared through the trees, the women were no longer thinking about rescue. They were thinking about survival. And survival, they were about to learn, did not mean what they hoped it meant. When the women reached the village, they expected the worst to happen immediately. Many believed death would come fast. Others feared pain. Almost all expected violence. What they did not expect was waiting. The village did not react the way they imagined. There was no cheering. No rush toward them. Instead, people came out slowly. Old men. Women. Children. They stood and stared. Some cried. Some whispered. Some looked at the captives the way someone looks at a ghost. This was especially true among the woodland tribes of the Northeast. These tribes had been losing people for years. Disease had taken children in their sleep. Smallpox had erased entire families. Wars with other tribes and settlers had killed young men faster than they could be replaced. Grief was everywhere, even if it was not spoken aloud. And now the captives were here. The women were pulled forward one by one. Some were struck. Others were ignored. A few were taken aside by older women who touched their faces, arms, hair. This was not affection. It was inspection. The first true shock came when the women were stripped. Their dresses were cut away or pulled over their heads. Shoes were removed. Any object from their old life, crosses, rings, cloth scraps, was taken. Then they were washed. Sometimes gently. Sometimes roughly. Cold water poured over skin already bruised and raw. This washing had meaning. It was meant to erase. After that, new clothes were given. Moccasins. Dresses made from animal skins. Beads. Shells. The women's hair was untied, cut, or restyled. Their reflection, if they saw it at all, no longer matched the person they remembered. Then came the ceremony. A name was spoken. not their name. A new one. Sometimes the name of a dead woman. A sister. A daughter. A wife. From that moment on, the captive was expected to answer to it. In the eyes of the tribe, she was no longer white. She was replacing the dead. This was adoption, but it was not kindness in the way Europeans understood it. It was need. It was survival. The woman was expected to work immediately. Cooking. Carrying water. Gathering wood. Farming. There was no rest for grief. Any refusal was dangerous. Any attempt to cling to the old life was punished. Prayers in English were forbidden. Christian symbols were mocked or destroyed. Ceremonies were forced upon them. Dances. Rituals. Songs they did not understand. This was how identity was broken. Not all women resisted. Some realized quickly that survival required obedience. They learned the language. They copied the movements of other women. They laughed when laughter was expected. They stayed silent when silence was safer. Over time, something strange happened. For some women, the pain dulled. The constant fear faded into routine. A woman who worked hard was praised. A woman who followed rules was protected. Children began to sit beside her. Old women corrected her gently instead of striking her. This terrified some captives more than cruelty ever could. Because it meant the tribe was not planning to kill them. It meant they were planning to keep them. And once a woman had lived long enough as someone else, the question was no longer how to survive. It was who she would become. Adoption did not mean freedom. It meant expectation. Once a woman had been given a new name and a place in the village, the real test began. From sunrise to darkness, she worked. Cooking over open fires. Carrying heavy loads of wood and water. Tending crops. Scraping hides until her hands split and bled. There was no concept of rest for someone who had not been born into the tribe. Every action was watched. Not openly, but constantly. A woman who worked hard earned fewer blows. A woman who learned quickly was corrected instead of punished. A woman who resisted, even quietly, learned how thin the protection really was. The greatest fear was not hunger or exhaustion. It was being seen as useless. Among many woodland tribes, rape during the early period of captivity was forbidden. This surprises people, but it is true. Sexual violence was considered dangerous to the social order. A captive woman was not yet a wife. She was not yet part of the tribe. To touch her too soon was to disrupt the process. But this restraint did not last forever. Once adoption was complete, once the woman was seen as belonging to the tribe, new expectations appeared. A man who had lost his wife might claim her. A family might decide she would replace a dead daughter fully, not only in labor, but in marriage. The woman had no voice in this decision. Marriage was not asked for. It was assigned. On the night it happened, many women later said they felt more fear than they had during the raid. Violence during capture was chaotic. This was controlled. Expected. Inevitable. Refusal was dangerous. Some women submitted in silence. Others resisted and were beaten until they stopped. A few were killed to make an example. But many survived, and over time, something uncomfortable happened. The marriage became normal. The man brought food. He defended her from others. He punished those who harmed her without reason. Children were born. And children changed everything. A woman who gave birth was no longer just a captive. She was a mother. And mothers mattered. Her position in the tribe grew stronger. Other women helped her. Older children protected her younger ones. Her labor still belonged to the tribe, but her life was no longer fragile in the same way. Some women began to feel something they could not explain. Safety. Not happiness. Not freedom. But safety. Years passed. Language replaced memory. English words faded. Old prayers were forgotten. Faces of dead husbands blurred. The pain did not vanish, but it no longer controlled every breath. When traders or soldiers finally arrived to negotiate ransoms, some women hid. They did not want to be found. Because leaving meant another loss. Another death. Another tearing away. White society expected gratitude. It offered judgment instead. Women who returned were stared at, questioned, shamed. Their children were called half-breeds. Their marriages were called sins. Their survival was treated as contamination. Some women chose the life that had once been forced on them because it no longer felt forced. Others were never given that choice. Because not all tribes treated captives this way. And for women taken by the wrong people, adoption was never offered at all. Not every woman was taken to a village where adoption was possible. For some, the moment of capture was the beginning of something far darker. On the Great Plains, life followed different rules. Tribes like the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache lived in constant motion. They were warrior societies shaped by endless conflict, against settlers, against soldiers, and against rival tribes. Survival depended on strength, fear, and reputation. Captives in these tribes were not replacements. They were property. From the first moment, the treatment was brutal. Women were often stripped during the raid itself. Not to erase identity, but to humiliate and break them. They were tied to horses, forced to ride for days without rest, beaten if they fell, beaten if they cried, beaten if they stayed silent. There were no adoption ceremonies. No new names. No pretending they belonged. They were slaves. Women were used for labor first. Carrying heavy loads. Pitching and striking camps. Gathering wood and water until their bodies gave out. Hunger was constant. Exhaustion never ended. Illness was ignored. And then there was the violence that history tried hardest to erase. Sexual assault was common. It was not hidden. It was not shameful in this context. It was a display of power. Women were assaulted by multiple men, sometimes in front of others, sometimes as punishment, sometimes simply because no one would stop it. Some women fought back. That courage often cost them everything. Beatings followed. Mutilation followed. Women who tried to escape were made examples of. Their suffering was meant to teach the others what resistance would bring. Children born from this violence existed in a terrible space. They belonged nowhere fully. Some were accepted. Others were ignored or mistreated. Their existence was proof of something everyone wanted to forget. And yet, even here, survival sometimes created strange shifts. A woman who endured without breaking could earn a form of respect. Not kindness. Not protection. But acknowledgement. Some captors grew used to her presence. Some women were defended by older women who had once been captives themselves. This did not erase the trauma. It did not make the suffering meaningful. It only made it survivable. When ransoms were discussed, women were traded like goods. A rifle, blankets, ammunition. A woman's value was measured by what she could produce and what she could endure. Many did not survive long enough to be ransomed. Those who did returned broken in ways no one wanted to see. White society did not know what to do with them. Their pain made people uncomfortable. Their stories challenged the idea that civilization was always gentle and that savagery existed only on one side. So their voices faded. They lived short lives, quiet lives. Or they died soon after returning, their bodies unable to carry what their minds never escaped. These women did not become legends. They became silence. And yet, their suffering shaped generations, whether history admitted it or not. When the wars finally slowed, when forts turned into towns and towns into states, people wanted the story to end cleanly. They wanted victory. They wanted villains and heroes. They wanted the past to sit still. But the women who survived captivity did not fit into that kind of ending. Some were ransomed back after months or years. Soldiers and traders arrived with papers and goods, expecting tears of joy. Sometimes they got them. Often they did not. Many women stared in confusion. Some screamed. Some ran back into the villages they had lived in for years. They were leaving one life behind again. Returning was not a rescue. It was another capture. White society did not understand these women anymore. They spoke differently. Some barely spoke English at all. They dressed strangely. They did not behave like proper wives or daughters. They had lived too long without permission. Women who had married native men were seen as ruined. Their children were seen as shameful. Churches judged them. Neighbors whispered. Families struggled to accept someone who had survived in ways polite society refused to imagine. Many captivity survivors were pressured to write their stories. But even those stories were edited. Sexual violence was softened or erased. Brutality was hinted at, not described. Publishers feared the truth. Readers feared it too. Victorian historians especially refused to record details they considered improper, even when those details explained everything. So the record became incomplete. And then there were the women who never came back. Some refused ransom. Some hid when soldiers came. Some fought when they were forced to leave. They had built lives, had children, had learned how to belong somewhere again. Being torn away destroyed them. Cynthia Ann Parker was one of many, not an exception. Her story became famous because it was recorded, not because it was rare. When she was forced back, she lost everything a second time. Her grief killed her more slowly than any weapon ever could. History struggled with that reality. It is easier to believe captivity only destroys. Harder to accept that survival can reshape identity so deeply that rescue feels like violence. The truth is this: there was no single experience. Some women were adopted and protected. Some were enslaved and broken. Some lived long lives and raised families. Some died on the trail. Some endured horrors that language still fails to carry. Some chose to stay. Some never had a choice at all. What they shared was loss. Loss of control. Loss of certainty. Loss of the world they were born into. These women were not symbols. They were not lessons. They were human beings trapped inside forces larger than themselves: disease, expansion, fear, and survival. Their stories refuse simple judgment. And that is why they matter. Because history is not a story about good people defeating bad people. It is a record of what happens when fear meets power, when survival overrides mercy, and when ordinary lives are pulled into extraordinary cruelty. The women who endured captivity lived in the space between worlds. And even now, centuries later, that space still makes people uncomfortable. Which is why their voices almost disappeared. Almost. But not entirely.